Anemoia is a word coined by the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, which means nostalgia for a time you've never known. What are some things that give you this feeling? As someone who lived through this time, the amount of nostalgia for it is crazy. Nostalgia as in man, they had it easy back then. It was not easier back then. Yes, I did pay my own way through college. Took 6 years to get a 4-year degree, working full-time and going to school part-time. Worked my ass off. I was one of the few. Most kids had mommy and daddy pay their way. Could still do it today, but because tuition increase is typically higher than wage increase, might take 8 years. As for buying a house, forget it. Not and go to college, not on a moderate job income. For fuck's sake, the economy was so bad in the 70s economists coined the new phrase, stagflation, to represent having high unemployment and inflation. A phenomenon previously thought impossible. Anytime I hear anyone talk about how the boomers had it easy, I just assume that person has never read a book. Up until I was 14, my video game time was heavily restricted, 2 hours a week if I was on break, and 1 hour if it was a school week. Luckily, I somehow discovered how to get emulators to work on the family PC as a 6-year-old. As a result, I spent most of my time playing Zero video games. Even though I was born in 2001, I'm much more nostalgic for Zero games than the DS era games I was actually around for. We used to do this all the time growing up, because it was cheaper than going to McDonald's or what the fuck ever. I cannot stand the sight, smell or taste of boiled eggs to this day because we ate so many of them on road trips driving up to visit my mama's people for a vacation. Like, we'd take coolers of drinks and food and just hit the damn road. Nearly every meal was eaten at some nasty-ass roadside rest stop that usually didn't even have a damn bathroom or anything. My brother had a comic book store. Used bookstore in suburban Detroit during that period. He also worked for a comic book distribution company at that time, so a truck with a shipment of comics would come in, and we'd break down the orders, then deliver them to stores throughout southeast Michigan and northwest Ohio. I remember grabbing my copy of each new issue of Watchmen, setting it aside, and rushing to divide up the orders so that I could sit down and read it. Just the idea of being a carefree teenager, going out on a Friday night and not knowing where the world would even take you. Parties, hanging with friends, drugs/sex/alcohol, spur-of-the-moment road trip. Nope. Every one of my Friday nights as a teen involved either church youth group, Halo multiplayer at one of my friends' homes, or both. Never anything more. Just would have been cool to cut loose at least a single time. It's over-glamorized by movies and really shit. A year ago my parents went away for a few weeks, and I took the opportunity to go a bit crazy and do what I wanted. I soon realized that I'll take hanging out at the beach with my proper friends over some overhook piss-up, with people I barely know, any day of the week. That's similar to what I feel and what sparked this question. I have this longing of being a teenager, young adult in the 90s, early 2000s. I was born in 2001 and let's face it, the 90s mostly bled into the early 2000s. What I really want is to have a few close friends over for a sleepover in my or one of their basement. I never lived in a place with a basement, and we'd stay up all night playing video games on like Xbox or PlayStation or Sega Genesis or Nintendo 64 or whatever was out at the time. We'd go late at night to Blockbuster, jam out to some Avril Lavigne or whatever on the way there, pick out a movie or two and get some candy. Come back and chill until the early morning. We'd wake up at sunrise all groggy but content and walk upstairs to Josever's parents making breakfast and asking how our night was. A few synthwave tunes. Resonance by Home was almost a meme a few years back because it went viral for inducing this exact feeling of being nostalgic for a time people have never known. The difference being that it now makes me nostalgic for one specific night at the end of the summer of 2017. It had been a great few months, and on a Friday evening before I started back at work, I went out with friends and stayed out until the early hours of the morning. We were sat on a roof, listening to this song while we watched the sun rise. Walking through the streets of my hometown in a snowstorm. You get these lulls in the storm where the wind dies off and the snow falls gently. I love going out and photographing then, but it's real quiet. There are no cars, just faint street lights, wood smoke hanging in the air, and rows of small one-story houses, and I get his sense of calm and realize this is what most evenings would have been like any time from the 1920s and earlier. Then I feel a desire to experience the turn of the 20th century. The quiet and the calm, evenings by candlelight, little or no electricity, just a fire in the stove to keep warm. The end of time. When the future remnants of whatever humanity has become billions and billions of years from now are all orbiting the last smoldering embers of the few remaining brown dwarfs left in the universe. Communication through the dead space amongst the random evolutionary offshoots of humanity orbiting those stars will have long faded away, and the sheer emptiness and loneliness of the vast darkness surrounding those left-over pockets of life will grow darker and deeper into the void. Resources will fade more and more, and traveling to another dying final star will become impossible. Eventually the last of humanity's evolutionary descendants will close their eyes for the last time, never to be opened again. Darkness forever. So I guess I have neo-post-contemporary future in Anemoia. Particularly in that time before agriculture was invented, there's some compelling enough reasons to believe that in some ways, life may have actually been better. No pollution, no getting stuck in traffic, no toxic workplaces, or ugly factories, no financial stress, no marital problems. In these Dravidic or shamanic cultures, I can't help but they might have had a few things figured out, and just lived a life very close to nature, but a good knowledge of plant medicines, and spent most of their time doing things that were more or less enjoyable. Some things that people do for recreational fun today, like hunting and fishing, would have been the whole experience, instead of spending most of our time in an office cubicle, or factory floor production line. We would have been in nature, hunting, fishing or gathering fruit. Then after sharing all our food, we would have sung songs, told stories, danced around and generally, probably just had a very free life, to the point where, it makes us ask, is all of this shit, these factories, computers, airplanes, internet, armies, states, national borders, supermarkets, farms, cars, is it all worth it? Does it really make our lives that much better? We live for longer, we've overcome certain diseases, but I'm not sure any of us imbued our lives with any extra meaning necessarily, over the ancient shamanic or Dravidic ways. We are sort of stuck here now though, in the madness of modernity equals. My mom was abusive and not loving. I'm now a stepmom and I strive to be nothing like her, but I get his feeling. I never bonded with my mom. I don't care about her even though I'm a very empathetic person, and helping these kids and seeing the wonderful parents that other kids have gives me this feeling sometimes that I missed out on a lot. Sometimes it's therapeutic to live out, hopefully, good parenting from the other side. It hurt to realize I was never loved before. Late night cruises and purring Evos and Datsuns, rolling through tunnels, slowly letting words fall out to my cousins in the car about how life is fucked, all of our families and childhoods are messed up, and just general on the verge of crying but being in a state of I could legit die RN. It brings me back to a childhood feeling, when I was safe in my parents' arms. Scouts is another thing where we play cards and just vibe till dawn. This isn't exactly Western, but just country life in general. I feel as though the two would be very similar. As someone who was raised on a farm in Alabama where you see more people on horses than on cars, I can say country life in any time is my. As a child it was so fun to feel like I was in an old novel, just running around with my hunting dogs and cousins through hundreds of wooded acres. We had all kinds of cool hidden places that were a 2-hour walk through the woods where it felt like we were the only kids in the world with no worries. It was such a great childhood. I still live deep in the woods to this day because of my upbringing. The problem is the people that live there. The politics are so fucking backwards. If I hadn't moved, I might not have ever met people of other races. I would probably still deal with major brainwashing from race, politics, and religion. It's so wild. Once I got older and formed my own ideals. Out of a huge family with 40+ people that hang out every holiday, I'm the only one who isn't a Christian. I'm the only one who isn't a Republican. I'm the only one who's dated outside my race. All those things don't stop in my family either. It's every fucking family. With those types, it's my way or the highway. I'm sure 200 years prior, a couple hundred miles west wouldn't be much different. Probably worse, tbh. The 90s and from my sister's life. During the time I was first born, some really heavy shit happened with my family where my parents split BC of my mom's postpartum depression from having me, which caused her to get heavily addicted to cocaine. From there, so much shit happened that I resent not remembering because it was so heavy and life-changing, and I feel it would heavily humble me to know what my family really had been through. I want to live all those important life memories from when I was really young that I can't remember well anymore. What are some things that give you this feeling? Pictures or movies? Times equals 1950s, 1930s, 1920s, and even the 1890s for whatever reason. Why? Because I think about how, in my own life, the 70s felt better than the 80s, which felt better than the 90s, which felt better than the last 21 years. So by that logic, going all the way back to, say, 1894 ought to be the equivalent of moving to paradise. I'd go to New York, walk around the streets, go to a ball game, take a ride on a streetcar and the ferry, etc. Literally any time pre-internet. While I remember not having cell phones or a computer, I just wish I was an adult in the non-internet age. As much as I loved online having with my bud in high school, I longed for a time when people had conversations like this face-to-face regularly. As hard as it is to find time for friends as an adult, I feel as though having a mini computer in your pocket to distract you at all times just doesn't help. I become such an old man. I was the Stranger Things character's age at that point in the early 80s. The show really does capture the feel of the time, especially not being tethered to technology. We rode our bikes everywhere, were gone for hours, and had to plan everything in advance, since once you left the house, you no longer had a means to communicate with each other. I have joined a few tech, software development companies, teams, and it is amazing how good things used to be back in the day. A few years according to the existing team. No deadlines, no stress, good communication. It is fairly common, but I have never experienced this nirvana. Maybe I am causing this problem, but I do find myself thinking that requirements and changes used to better thought out and planned years ago. I look at some projects and they spend years planning on the hardware and software that they use. I think that sounds great until you actually have to do it. But back in the day everyone did this. Actually no, they didn't, but I still like to think they did. The song Suburbia by Troye Sivan makes me feel nostalgic for the better days of my youth, when in reality my childhood was full of trauma and mental health problems. I don't look back on those days with fondness, but something about that song makes me feel like I'm seeing into an alternate past, one that was actually the good old days. The family unit as portrayed in the 50s. Dad had his job that paid well enough to keep the family comfortable. The house was clean, home-cooked meals, kids went to school and learned. Weekend BBQs. Not this. Mom works part-time, dad works full-time in a part-time gig, just to afford a shitty apartment. Kids sometimes went to school but only when they needed more dope. Neighbors more likely to break into your home while you are working than to host a BBQ. The time when the world was not thoroughly mapped, and it was possible to discover new places. I was obsessed with pioneer life as a kid, thanks Laura Ingalls, and was genuinely heartbroken to learn that there was only the bottom of the ocean and space left to discover. The Earth had been done, literally to death. Of course, nothing on the Earth was actually new, or undiscovered, except New Zealand, but the pull to see the new and novel, to be an explorer. This feeling is often triggered in adulthood by my family history research. I was born in the mid-1990s, but during early spring, when the snow has begun melting but the trees are still bare and there is an overcast on the sky, I get this weird nostalgia for the 1960s, not the fancy, iconic 60s, but instead being a child in Northern Europe in the 1960s who is on her way home from school. I guess it is sort of a longing for a simpler time and for a life that would have been very different from my current adult life in 2021. I hope I'm not too late to this. I was born in the 90s and have generalized anxiety. My biggest soothing activity is listening to music from the 30s and 40s. Maybe it really reminds me of my grandparents, modern steakhouses, and old movies where the leading character always wins, but I long to be walking down a city street in a fedora and fresh suit, smoking a Lucky Strike. Watching TCM films, especially from the 1930s, the suits, the cars, the fast-paced wisecracks, whiskey and cigarettes 24/7. I know it's a fiction, based on then-current styles. I know it was an era of Jim Crow and limited rights for people outside the mainstream, rising fascism and we are on the horizon, and antiquated medical options. But I'd still like to visit for a while. I know this is weird, but the Cold War, at least the culture around it. I was born in late 70s, so as a kid I was exposed to the surface level stuff, but I was too young to really understand or get any of it. When the USSR fell I was in my early teens. Then I went to college and got a degree in poli-sci and economics and actually learned a lot about the era. And if I had been a college student back then I 100% would have tried my best to spend a semester abroad in a Cold War hotspot if at all possible, because everything about that entire thing, from the 50s through to the end, fascinates me. Even to this day, I'm a little disappointed, because a lot of the Cold War stuff being made now is through the lens of the internet, war on terror, etc. and not really about the Cold War, and that essentially means there's little new culture being produced about it. Any sunny day during the non-summer months, especially the weekends, it makes me feel nostalgic for the times I went out to bike with my friends, except that rarely ever happened. Most weekends I was stuck at home because my mom forbade me from having an active social life and disapproved of me having friends at all. She thought it was a distraction to studying. Also, I see you quoting Sauce. The internet of the mid-late 2000s, 2006 to 2008 or thereabouts. My earliest memory of the internet is 2009, so I'm using that as the cut-off point. It feels like a crossroads point of sorts, the beginnings of the current status quo of the internet, yet still rooted in the old, and still with a hint of the old Wild West feeling, somehow fresh and decentralized and not yet entirely corporate-dominated. Before DA went to shit with Eclipse, I remember finding a strange sort of sad nostalgia in going through old accounts from that period. People for whom it was a part of their life, a community, a small world long since gone where they were active, grew, evolved, all culminating in that final sentence last online 647 weeks ago. The 60s. There was a lot of bad shit going on and lots of things changed for the better. I'm under no illusions that it was a better time, but the excitement in the air must have been amazing. Technology was changing at a rapid pace. We landed on the moon, birth control, mostly equal rights, etc. It seemed like no part of our society and culture was safe and the changes were coming. I'd like to think the 60s were kind of like the 90s but more upbeat. I'm a sucker for that blonde girl in a wheat field shit. Some know what I mean. Even if I wanted to join that or try for that utopia, the others who want that fantasy would actively shoot dead trans folks, so I'm kinda sold. But it's funny recognizing the impulse. I'm also pretty keen on the Blade Runner aesthetic raffle. I'm also pretty into the 1920s hats and railroads and horses and all. My grandpa, born in 1931, spent his first 11 or so years in a small town in southeast Montana. His maternal grandparents lived there along with a lot of his mom's family. It was a small town then, and now there's a bar, a community center, a cemetery, and not much else. It's a beautiful little spot off the highway. My grandpa loved to tell stories about his childhood there, and they visited often when he and my grandma were married. About 4 years before he died, We all went there so my grandpa could show us around. There was this one moment where he was leaning on the stone barrier of a bridge, kind of looking into the creek beneath, and I wondered what he was thinking about.